Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight. My name is Michael Fleischer. I'm a sophomore history major from Denver, Colorado, and it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Bogdanovich. Peter Bogdanovich is a director, screenwriter, actor, film scholar, and film critic. A recipient of several Oscar nominations and Film Critic Awards, Mr. Bogdanovich made his directorial debut with the Oscar-nominated The Last Picture Show. He went on to direct numerous other films, including Paper Moon, Mask, The Cat's Meow, She's Funny That Way, and most recently, The Great Buster, A Celebration. His many television credits include the Emmy Award-winning HBO show, The Sopranos, and an episode of The Simpsons. He directed the 2007 documentary Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Runnin Down a Dream, which won a Grammy Award. He is the author or editor of several books, including Who the Devil Made It? Conversations with Legendary Film Directors, and Who the Hell's in It? Conversations with Hollywood's Legendary Actors. Please welcome Mr. Bogdanovich.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you. Is there a mic here? Oh, it's on, that's right. I'm not really crippled. I have to use this, otherwise I'll fall down because I broke my leg a while ago. But I'm all right. I just look like I'm not all right. Nice to see you all. It's a cold day today. I guess it's not. I was told from the inhabitants who live here all the time that it wasn't a cold day today. Sure felt cold to me. I normally sit at the podium, but I thought I'd better sit down today because my leg is bothering me a little bit. John Ford. John Ford. Well, I knew him for about, I met him in 1960. I knew him for about 15 years. He was quite a character. I'll tell you some stories. I got a few stories here to tell you. The first time I met him was on a picture called Cheyenne Autumn, which was his last Western. It wasn't really the best Western he ever made. It was probably his least good, but it has some moments. And I was on the set in Monument Valley. And I was afraid to meet him. And the unit publicity guy was afraid to introduce me to him. I said, Warner Brothers had approved my coming there, and I was writing for Esquire. And I said to the publicity guy, I'm the unit publicist, he said, who are you here to interview? I said, John Ford. He said, oh, no. What do you mean, no? Warner Brothers said, no. You see how he's chewing on that handkerchief? I said, yeah. That means he's very, 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 very angry, which is not true, by the way. And so he wouldn't introduce me to him. So I hung around, watched for a while, and then a couple of days later on a weekend, I saw Carol Baker, who was in the picture, and her husband, Jack Garfine, a director, he just died in my life. And I knew Jack vaguely, not very well. And Jack said, what are you doing here? I said, well, Carol was in the picture. And I said, I'm here to interview John Ford, but they won't introduce me to him. They're scared of him. He said, oh, that's ridiculous. So Jack introduced me to Ford. Ford was very nice to me, sort of pleasant. He said, sit down, and we talked for a while. He said to me, he didn't say, are you Serbian? He just said a dirty word in Serbian to me, govno, which means shit. And I laughed, and that was about it. The next day, on the location in Monument Valley, there was a stunt done. The guy rode down the hill, the stuntman, and jumped off the horse before the horse stopped and handed Dick Widmark a message. That was the shot. So he did it, the guy did it fine, and Ford said, that's fine, that's well, print that. And he turns to me, I was standing fairly close to him at this point. We had just sort of been on the set. And he said, how about that? Now I was, 22 or 23, I didn't know what the hell to say. He turns to me and says, how about that? So I said, yeah, that looked kind of difficult. He looked at me with such disgust. He just looked at me with total disgust and walked away and turned and said, yeah, I'd say it was difficult. I'd say it was very difficult. And he walked away. I said, shit. So I got the hell out of there. I stayed away from him as far as I could stay away from him. About 2 hours later, they did another something else with the horse and so on. And I'm way far away from him at this point. Bogdanovich! So I run over to him. Yes, Mr. Ford. How'd that look? That look difficult to you? And that went on for the entire time I was there. Difficult? Just wanted to see if you thought it was difficult. Now, usually, I'm going to read you some stuff I wrote here. If I switch glasses. These are awful glasses. You'll pardon me. But I look like Mr. Moto. Mr. Ford was in bed, which, as he often was when not shooting, watching TV or half listening to my attempts at a conversation. This is some years later. I would go, he'd allow me to come over to his house in Bel Air, and I would sit in the director's chair, and he would be in bed watching TV, half listening to my attempts at a conversation. Even if the TV had not been on, Mr. Ford's attitude toward me would have been gruff and lightly sardonic. This was not unexpected, however, since I would mainly talk about his movies. And John Ford would never allow himself to be caught taking any real interest in a discussion of his work, or pictures in general. He was 75 at the time, 1970, with less than 3 years to live. I was a 31-year-old director with 2 movies to my credit, one a documentary directed by John Ford. He had been in the film business for over 57 years, 53 of them as a director. Only 1 decade before Jack Ford got into pictures, the film business did not exist, nor the art of movie direction. Ford had made 136 pictures. The film business did not, made some of which in the 30-odd years between 1931 and 1964, earned 72 Oscar nominations. They won 23, including 6 that went to him directly. The New York film critics voted him Best Director 4 times. Both achievements still hold the record today. He had been responsible for creating not only the screen personas of several key actors, most prominently John Wayne and Henry Fonda, but an extraordinary number of America's favorite and most enduring pictures. Among them, The Informer, Stagecoach, The Grapes of Wrath, How Green Was My Valley, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, and The Quiet Man. Every so often, after being consistently edgy and sarcastic, or soon after a particularly cutting remark, Ford would smile at me in an openly affectionate way. This might start me waxing eloquent again on some scene of his, or asking some yet another convoluted or weighty question, and pretty soon he would be insulting me again. Jesus Christ, Bogdanovich, can't you ever end a sentence with anything but a question mark? Have you never even heard of the declarative sentence? Most people were intimidated by John Ford. His appearance certainly contributed. Grizzled face, with one black eye patch over thick glasses. I wore one because my eye was bothering me, and I looked too much like him, so I stopped wearing it. A short cigar stuck in his mouth, or a portion of a long white handkerchief which soon turned brown from chewing. His usual expression was either a purposeful, slightly sardonic, slightly belligerent deadpan, or a scowl. Since he always scorned talk of social significance or of art, never discussed his experiences in World War II, in which he had been wounded and decorated, and spoke of himself simply as, quote, a hard-nosed movie director, unquote, who enjoyed making pictures as, quote, a job of work, unquote. It was difficult to find permissible areas to approach. I mentioned, nervously, that John Wayne's birthday was coming up, and that I was thinking of giving him a book. Without turning from the TV, Ford said loudly, Whenever he wanted to humiliate, Ford would feign deafness and make you repeat several times the thing you just said. So I repeated about John Wayne's birthday and the gift I was planning, a book. For a third time, even louder, Ford said, I nearly shouted the words, birthday and book. Angrily, Ford said, a what? I repeated, a book. Then suddenly Ford's expression changed completely, becoming reasonable and relaxed. Oh, he said, and turned back to the TV. He grunted and put a corner of the large white handkerchief into his mouth. He chewed meditatively for a few moments before looking at me again, and, enunciating precisely, he said, he's got a book. When Ford turned back to the TV, there was a hint of a smile beneath his fixed expression. Ford's remark was not only a devastating comment on a man he profoundly loved and had, to the greatest degree, helped to create. Certainly without John Ford, there never would have been a John Wayne. I had known Wayne for 5 years by then, Ford for 7, and the father-son relationship between them was fairly clear. Wayne loved Ford, but was still thoroughly intimidated by him. He was privately both critical and frightened of the coach, as he called him, or Jack, the man after whom Duke Wayne had most patterned himself. Wayne once told me his response to Ford on Stagecoach, the 1939 Western that had made him a major star. After Wayne had seen the Rushes for the first time, Ford asked him how he liked himself in it. Wayne shrugged and said, well, you know what that is. I'm just playing you. There was a similarity in many of their mannerisms, especially the graceful way both gestured with their hands and arms. The famous rolling John Wayne walk was Jack Ford's walk. Wayne's brusque screen character was Ford's in real life. But Ford wasn't 6'4", with a strikingly handsome face and ultra-manly physique. Off camera, Wayne was gregarious, warm, and outgoing, quick to laugh, strangely innocent. Ford, while I knew him, was much like the older characters Wayne had begun to play in Red River, the Western he did with Howard Hawks in 1947. Hawks would tell me that over the years, Ford invariably was erroneously complimented for directing Red River. Ford always nodded, smiled modestly, and said, thank you very much. Hawks put it succinctly, I don't see how a person can make a Western without being influenced by John Ford. And Hawks, who never made a Western without Wayne, he made 5 of them, was not being generous. He could as easily have extended the influence to most American pictures, because Ford had long ago become as synonymous with the great American film as Jean Renoir had with the great French film. Before Orson Welles made his first 2 pictures, Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons, he studied one film exclusively. Welles would tell me he had run John Ford's Stagecoach 40 times. For Kane, he also hired one of Ford's favorite cameramen, Greg Toland. Both pictures owe no small amount to Ford's visual influence. Although Ford was most famous for Westerns, he did not make a talking one until 10 years after sound came in. Yet his career had begun in the silent era, and during his first 3 years as a director, Ford made only Westerns, 30 of them, nearly all starring Harry Carey. During the 20s, he made a dozen more, helping to create cowboy stars out of Buck Jones, Hoot Gibson, Tom Mix, and George O'Brien. The first of his pictures to be a runaway success at the box office was a Western, The Iron Horse. Ford had released in the summer of 1924. For his wife Mary's Christmas present, 2.5 years later, Ford had a new Rolls-Royce delivered to the front door with a fur coat on the back seat. The note attached read, "This ought to hold you for a while." He meant it and gave her no other presents for many years. The vast majority of Ford's films dealt with historical subjects. The American Revolutionary War and Civil War, the Indian Wars, the building of the railroads, the taming of the West, the creation of a new civilization. Yet the early Westerns he made depicted incidents and lives then barely 30 years past. Ford not only made movies about the famous marshal and gunfighter Wyatt Earp, but he had known the man and others of the epoch well. They told him how it had been. During the 30s, Ford guided Spencer Tracy and Humphrey Bogart through their first feature, and Will Rogers through 3, including his last, as well as directed a number of popular, highly regarded films, among them Aerosmith, The Lost Patrol, Hurricane, and The Informer, which, for 1935, won Ford his first Academy Award as Best Director and his first New York Film Critics Prize. Because he had fought against studio interference and opposition to get the Irish Story done, The Informer turned Ford into the hero of the critics and the public. He was already married for 15 years to Mary McBride Smith, a magnificent, extraordinarily resilient woman, a direct descendant of Sir Thomas More. And they were the parents of a teenage son and daughter, and Ford's reputation as a family man and artist had never been stronger. At this moment, his personal life was rocked to its foundation. Ford, now 40, fell profoundly in love with a woman of 26 named Katharine Hepburn. Who also fell in love with him. It happened while the two of them were shooting the film version of Maxwell Anderson's historical drama Mary of Scotland. Neither Ford nor Hepburn ever spoke of their affair, but of course the families knew. The attraction between them, the explosiveness and independence of both their natures, can be seen reflected in several of the key romantic relationships in Ford's subsequent pictures, notably in the extraordinarily rich emotional interplay between Maureen O'Hara and Walter Pidgeon as the forbidden lovers in How Green Was My Valley, and between Clark Gable and Ava Gardner, who was nominated as Best Actress in Mogambo. Despite their feelings for each other, Ford and Hepburn came to a difficult and painful conclusion. He was an Irish Catholic, married to a woman he dearly loved, and with a passionate belief in family. The 13th and last child of Irish immigrants, his father was a saloon owner in Maine. Ford was now a famous, wealthy, and respected figure in the world, and Katharine Hepburn was already well on her way to the longest and most influential career of any woman in movies. She had become a top star and won an Oscar after her first Hollywood season, only 2 years before meeting Ford, and had been nominated again the same year he won his first. Her reputation for integrity and Yankee strong-mindedness matched his. Their first encounters were volatile, but Ford was remarkably gallant and courteous with women, and always pleased with and refreshed by a well-phrased and reasoned argument. When he made Mogambo in Africa, Ava Gardner was cast in the picture, and she came on the set the first day, or before they shot, and she was introduced to Ford, and Ford said, "You know, I didn't want you, I wanted Maureen O'Hara." And she said, "Well, you got Ava Gardner, so you can shit in your hat." And he loved her for that, and gave her every scene in the picture. You watch it, you see it's all for Ava, even though Clark Gable was the star. But Kate Hepburn of Hartford, Connecticut, and Jack Ford of Portland, Maine, were a match made in heaven. But on the other hand, they both knew how badly their relationship might damage their individual careers and their ability to do what they had obviously been born at precisely the right time to do. They both knew how good they were and how much more they still had to accomplish. When he and Hepburn decided they could never work together again, they both would have known the degree of happiness they were giving up. The decision, a kind of glorious and idealistic sacrifice, is echoed in most of Ford's subsequent pictures. The burden of duty, tradition, honor, and family is among his central themes. 8 years later, Hepburn would begin the longest secret love affair in picture history with another married Irish Catholic father named Spencer Tracy. A liaison that yielded a handful of memorable co-starring vehicles and was not revealed until after Tracy's death. It's difficult not to see a connection between her screen behavior with Tracy and her love not only for him, but also for Jack Ford, the truly secret and romantic one. Ford and Hepburn remained close friends throughout Ford's life. She also had a warm relationship with Mary Ford that continued until Mary died, 5 years after Jack. In The Quiet Man, Ford's single most passionately romantic picture, made in Ireland at age 57, the Maureen O'Hara character combined the best qualities of the two women who, apart from his mother, Ford most loved. Her name in the film was Mary Kate. Within 2 short years of his and Hepburn's decision, within 2 short years of after his and Hepburn's decision, Ford would begin the most expressive, emotionally charged, and poetic series of films in American film history. Between 1938 and 1941, while America stayed out of the war, at ages 43 to 46, Ford directed 7 profoundly affecting movies. Those 3 release years were by far the most productive of quality in Hollywood's entire history. If any one period was the peak for the American screen, it was the years 1939 to 1941, after which the U.S. entry into World War II altered everything. It was Ford's competition in these years included not only Gone with the Wind, which earned 13 nominations in 1939, against 9 for 3 of Ford's pictures, all released that same year, but also a score of other popular and critical milestones in that era, from Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington to Lubitsch's Dinochka, from The Wizard of Oz to Citizen Kane. The Academy nominated Ford each year, and he won the last 2. The New York film critics voted him Best Director all 3 years. Ford's constant work conveniently managed to prevent him from personally appearing to accept any of the awards. This remarkable burst of creativity began appropriately with a Western. Although Stagecoach was his 90th film, it was not only his first Western since the advent of sound, but also his first Western in 13 years. Loosely based on a de Maupassant story, Stagecoach began the John Wayne myth and established Monument Valley, which straddles Arizona and Utah, as Ford's own personal special country of the West, setting a standard for Westerns that only 2 or 3 others, including Ford himself, would ever equal or transcend. His other 2 films of 1939 starred Henry Fonda, Drums Along the Mohawk, Ford's first film in color, and Young Mr. Lincoln. The director had to browbeat the actor into accepting the role of Lincoln in their first of 7 features together. Fonda recalled Ford demanding, what do you think you're going to be playing? The Great Emancipator or something? This is a young jack-legged lawyer from Springfield, for God's sake. The death of Lincoln's early love, Anne Rutledge, and his abiding faith in her spirit reverberate through the picture. Ford's other films of this period are The Grapes of Wrath, Tobacco Road, The Long Voyage Home, and How Green Was My Valley. In August 1941, 4 months before Pearl Harbor put America in the war, Ford, age 46, went on active duty in the U.S. Navy. With the rank of lieutenant commander, eventually becoming a 2-star admiral, he was appointed chief of the Field Photographic Branch, a unit of the OSS, reporting directly to his friend, Colonel William Wild Bill Donovan. Though Ford was even more closed-mouthed about his war activities than he was normally about everything else, he once told a reporter, quote, "Our job was to photograph, both for the records and for intelligence assessment, the work of guerrillas, saboteurs, resistance outfits. Besides this, there were special assignments," unquote. Except for his work on several war documentaries, winning him 2 more Oscars, Ford would not direct a new picture for nearly 4 years. Decorated a number of times, Ford was also given the Purple Heart for injuries sustained during the Battle of Midway, which he personally photographed with a handheld 16mm camera, even after receiving shrapnel fragments in the arm and groin. The battles that they were filming in Hollywood with Duke Wayne were being lived overseas by Jack Ford. Toward the end of the war, the Navy asked Ford to make a picture with Wayne in the line of duty. Typically, Ford chose America's worst defeat in the Philippines as the background to what would become the finest and most compassionate of American war films. They Were Expendable. A deal was struck with MGM, and Ford demanded from Louis B. Mayer the highest salary ever paid at the time to a director, $400,000, and donated all of it to build a recreation center in Los Angeles for veterans of his naval unit. The first movie Ford directed after the war was a Western, shot in Monument Valley with Henry Fonda playing Wyatt Earp, and climaxed by a recreation of the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. My Darling Clementine surpassed Stagecoach, but received almost no special attention. Of the 30-odd films Ford directed in the last 20 years of his active career, half of them were Westerns. Ford had realized that the form he had so greatly influenced and almost single-handedly perfected into a unique American art could be the equivalent of the myths or legends of the ancient religions and histories of Europe. As the modern post-war world became increasingly disheartening to Ford and less interested in his work, especially his Westerns, he continued nevertheless to explore the themes that profoundly concerned him. Unquestionably, these Westerns were his most mature and resonant achievements. From the towering Cavalry Indian War trilogy with Wayne, Fonda, O'Hara, and the rest of the Ford family of players, best viewed in this order: Fort Apache, 1948, Rio Grande, 1950, and She Wore Yellow Ribbon, 1949. To the darkening, increasingly tragic series of frontier stories that began in 1956 with Wayne in The Searchers, and it ended in 1962 with Wayne and Stewart in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, perhaps the two richest and most complex Westerns ever made. Ford's 1962 Western, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, is not only Ford's elegiac, final, artistically successful look at the American West he had chronicled since his first films in 1917. It is also, unquestionably, the last masterwork of the movie's golden age, which, as I see it, ended that very same year, 1962. Remarkably prophetic of the country's darkening future, Marilyn Monroe's mysterious death came that year, and John F. Kennedy's shocking murder the following year was only the first of the modern-day assassinations. The picture is also a complex variation on what Robert Graves called, quote, the single poetic theme, unquote, a triangular love story of two men in love with the same woman. Little water here. Based on a Dorothy Johnson short story and is starkly photographed in black and white, the tale is told almost entirely in flashback. Jimmy Stewart plays an aged, much-loved Western senator who, with his wife, Vera Miles, returns to the small town of Shinbone for the pauper's funeral of a forgotten rancher, John Wayne. The local newspaper editor is naturally most curious to see as to why Stewart's distinguished American figure, known everywhere as the Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, a notoriously violent outlaw, played by Lee Marvin, why he's come all the way from Washington to pay his final respects to a man no one ever heard of. Stewart tells him and the story unfolds. Years before, as an idealistic young pacifist attorney, Stewart had followed Tom Greeley's advice and gone west to help bring the law there. Robbed and brutally beaten by Valance, he is saved by Wayne, a prosperous young rancher, and nursed back to health by Wayne's intended, a local restaurant owner's feisty daughter, Vera Miles, whom Stewart teaches to read and falls for in the process. This sets the stage for a complicated showdown between Wayne and Stewart, who are on opposite sides philosophically about the way order and law must be won, as well as being rivals in romance. Of course, there is also the showdown brewing between Marvin's vicious Valance and either Stewart or Wayne, a confrontation that finally, irrevocably, and ironically, decides the outcome of the love triangle. The truth of what really happened and how Liberty Valance actually did get shot and killed is considerably different from the legend we have been led to believe. But when the flashbacks are over, the newsman refuses to publish what he has been told, and he tells Stewart as he tears up the article, "When the legend becomes fact, sir, print the legend." Yet we also come to understand that although Stewart and Miles have been married for decades, her truest love has remained with the man in the pine box she's come to bury. None of this is spelled out in so many words, and I'm purposely not filling in the details so as to preserve the impact for those of you who haven't seen the picture. Suffice it to say that the ending and the way it is achieved have powerful emotional associations, not only within the picture itself, but in its overall relationship to the whole of Ford's work. Metaphorically, the film concludes with an America whose heroes are ambiguous or tainted, and whose yearning for the wilderness, for the time before frontiers were settled, remains its deepest passion. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is not a young man's movie. It has the wisdom and poetic perceptions of an artist knowingly nearing the end of his life and career. Ford was 67 when he made the picture, and he directed only a couple more, none with the personal intensity of this one. In the score, he even reprises a musical theme by Alfred Newman, which he had used over 2 decades earlier in Young Mr. Lincoln of 1939. A musical theme that had movingly represented an unrequited love, something Ford understood profoundly, since his own adoration of Katharine Hepburn in the late 1930s also had an unhappy ending. I'll never forget the one time I was sitting in the bedroom with Ford, and the phone rang in the other room, and somebody came in and said, Miss Hepburn is on the phone. And I'll never forget, it touches me now, the way he said, Kate, and jumped out of bed to have the conversation. All the performances in this movie are rich in archetypal reverberations. The entire cast helps to make this one of the glories of the American studio system, with whose collapse it not so coincidentally coincides. And that's my story about that. I'm going to open it up for questions in a minute. What time is it? We got time for questions?
We do. Thank you, Mr. Bogdanovich.
One question. I'm just trying to remember. There's another Ford story I'm trying to remember now. Let's go ask some questions, because I'll remember it shortly.
All right. So Mr. Bogdanovich will be signing copies of his book, Who's the Hell in It? Who the Hell's in It? Conversations with Hollywood's legendary actors immediately following the speech in the Searle lobby. We now have time for a few questions. Please make your way to the microphone if you have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Bogdanovich. You are a treasure.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I don't recall the movie, but there was a biopic about Spig Weed, and Ward Bond, who was...
What did you say?
About Spig Weed.
Yeah, the Wings of Eagles.
Wings of Eagles. And Ward Bond played John Ford.
Right.
How accurate was Ward Bond's portrayal of John Ford in that movie?
Well, Ward was better looking. It was pretty good. Pretty good portrayal. It was kind of cleaned up a bit, but it was that movie, as a matter of fact. It's a picture nobody's ever heard of, and it's again about a love story, kind of a love story between love and duty. The Wings of Eagles, John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara. Very good picture. Very good picture about a relationship with two people that were pretty strong, and how they got along or didn't. Very good picture. Nobody saw it, but it was good. What else?
Sir, thank you for coming to Hillsdale College.
Oh,
I'm over here.
Hi.
Question, in 1961, I was in junior high school, and we could never figure out why Gene Pitney's song, The Man Who Killed Liberty Valance, wasn't in the movie. Can you answer that question?
No, probably Ford didn't want it in the movie, because everybody was putting songs into westerns, which started with Fritz Lang, believe it or not, in 1951 or 2 in a picture called Rancho Notorious. Not one of Fritz's best films, but kind of interesting film. Marlene Dietrich. And there was a song in that called Fate, Murder and Revenge, or something like that. And it was a kind of a song that was pretty interesting. And then High Noon had a song, of course, "Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling, on this your wedding day." Anyway, that was a big hit. Tex Ritter sang that, and I think, and then it became a kind of a thing. Every Western had to have a song, and I'm sure Ford said, "Hell with that." In fact, Liberty Valance was originally started to be shot in color, And after looking at dailies for a couple of days, Ford said, no, we can't do this in color. The reason was because both Stewart and Wayne, not so much Wayne, but Stewart and Vera Miles had to play younger in certain parts of the flashback and older. And makeup, young makeup, or old makeup for that matter, is shit in color. Sorry, but it is. And in black and white, you can get away with anything. So we went to black and white, and it worked. I've done both, color and black and white. I prefer black and white, by the way.
Hi.
Ford said, you'll probably call me old-fashioned, but I think black and white is real photography. Okay, next.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I've got a question on the genre of Westerns in general. Just the Western motif, and often it's said that media reflects the culture of the times in which it exists.
Right.
And, you know, we had Westerns like Gunsmoke and Bonanza and Roy Rogers and all this Western stuff at a time when the West had already been won. What was it about America that has enamored with Western motifs in movies and TV and other media?
Well, I think John Ford was responsible for creating that affection. And there were some very good Westerns made after Ford, but Ford sort of made the best ones. And people like, it's the American saga, you know, and the Western is kind of emblematic of that. And it's simple story, good and evil, and the whole thing about the fastest draw and all that stuff is mostly bullshit. But you know, it has a certain charm, and it's like the old, as I said in this piece, it's the oldest kind of ties in with the old legends of Europe as well. So it's our past being remembered by various different artists, and there's been some good Westerns made by other people besides Jack Ford. I mean, Red River, Howard Hawks made two of the best ones, Red River and Rio Bravo, and El Dorado's not bad either. I remember I said to Hawks one time something about Ford, looked like it was influenced by Ford, and he said, I don't see how you can make a Western without him being influenced by Jack Ford. I don't see how you can make a picture without being influenced by him. And Howard was his own, you know, the last time I saw Ford, he was on his deathbed. He died about 3 months after this. And he was living in Palm Desert, having moved from Bel Air because his business manager had stole a lot of his money. So he had to move at an old age to Palm Desert, which is a nice place. And he was there with Mary, his wife. And Howard Hawks called me. He says, I'm going to go see Jack in Palm Desert. You want to come see with me? Which was kind of flattering, I must say. So Howard Hawks and I was a pisher still, and Hawks was, you know, getting on. Howard Hawks was only 1 year younger than Ford, but he acted like a kid around Ford. He was like, everybody was intimidated by Ford. So we come into his bedroom, Ford's bedroom, and I remember I entered the room a kind of a second sooner than he thought I was going to come in, and I caught him adjusting himself into position, that he struck a pose. And so we came in, we're talking, and Jack says to Howard, does he ask you all those goddamn questions all the time? And Howard said, yeah, he does, Jack. How do you stand it? That was friendly. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bogdanovich, for speaking to us tonight. I wonder if you might have any stories to tell about one of my favorite personal Western actors who you had a chance to work with in Last Picture Show and John Ford did in Wagon Master, Ben Johnson. Do you have any stories to tell us about him?
Well, Ben turned me down 3 times. I wanted him to play the part in the Last Picture Show. It was a great part for him. And I couldn't decide who should play it. And when I finally thought of Ben, whom I had met on Cheyenne Autumn, briefly, I said, Ben Johnson, he's perfect. And I called him and I offered him, gave him the script and so on. He turned it down. He said, too many words, Pete. Too many words. So I asked him, and he just wouldn't do it. So I called Ford, and I said, I got a really good part for old Ben, and he says there's too many words. He won't do it. And Ford said, oh, geez, he always says that. When he came on the set and she wore a yellow ribbon, he went over to the script girl. He said, any words for me today? And if she said yes, he'd go off and sulk. And if she said no, you just got to ride the horse, he'd be happy. Where is old Ben? He's in Tucson. Oh, give me his number, I'll call him. Will you? Yeah, I'll call him for you. So I gave him the number, and about 10, 12 minutes later, he calls me back. He'll do it. You really? I said. He said, yeah. I said to him, what do you want to play Duke's sidekick your whole life, Ben? Come on, Pete's got a good picture for you. Why don't you do it? He'll do it. I said, oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Jack. He said, okay, boy. Hang up. Now, Ben Johnson didn't agree to do it. He came into my office, and he had decided he was not going to do it. Too many words, Pete. It's too many words. I said, Ben, if you play this part, you could get the Oscar. Why the hell do you say that? He said to me, like that, loud. He had the script open in front of him. And I said, I don't know, I just think you in this part will win the Oscar. He did, by the way. And so I never forget it. He agreed to do it this way. The script was open in front of him. And he went, oh, all right, I'll do the goddamn thing. And that's how he got the Oscar. I remember one line he had to say. He said, when you go down to Mexico, he says to the two boys, you be careful, don't drink any, be careful of that buggy water or something. And one of the boys says, oh, we're just going to drink beer and tequila. And Ben's line was, catch the clap, you'll wish you hadn't drunk nothing. And Ben said, when we first take, Ben says, you catch the miseries, you'll wish you hadn't drunk nothing. I said, cut miseries, Ben? Yeah, I don't want to say that other word. Well, it's not funny with miseries, Ben. He said, well, I ain't going to say that other word. My mother might want to see this picture. He said it finally. I remember John Wayne said to me, he says, I saw your picture, Pete. That last picture showed, Jesus Christ, I can't show that picture to my family. That's the way it goes.
My question pertains specifically to Liberty Valance and the love triangle. Do you think that is the difference between, the love triangle? Do you think that pertains specifically to like the political philosophical views that they each represent, or is it more of like the romantic part of it that maybe pertained more to Ford's life? Which do you think like Ford was more attracted to in that?
That's a good question. I think both. Because the Wayne character says, you can't make a deal with Liberty Valance. He's a killer. He's a vicious killer, and he only deserves to be shot and killed, frankly. That's what he's basically saying. And Jimmy Stewart says, we make him read books, and that's not going to work. So it is that sort of conflict between one approach and another approach. And I think Ford is ambivalent about that, because there are certain killer types who you can't educate. And so it's complicated. Ford was not, did not give political statements. He used to say, I'm apolitical. And he just wasn't, it wasn't his thing. I remember one story, though, it was interesting. In the 50s, there was a kind of end of the 40s, early 50s, a kind of a Red Scare. And Hollywood evolved into a kind of blacklist. People who were left were out, and people who were right were okay. So if you were left-ish, you got blacklisted. It was pretty rough. Orson Welles used to said to me once, he said, they betrayed their friends to save their swimming pools. It was tough. So Joseph L. Mankiewicz was the president of the Directors Guild. And and C.B. DeMille, Cecil B. DeMille, was the most successful director in Hollywood, in the movies. And he was pushing for the Directors Guild to demand that its members sign a loyalty oath. And there were people who, Mankiewicz himself didn't agree to that, didn't think it was the right thing to do. And a lot of people didn't like the idea, but a lot of people did, so it was a conflict. So they had a big meeting of all the directors, and Ford showed up. And he sat on the aisle, and as somebody said, Sammy Fuller, a director, a friend of mine, told me this story, and so did Joe Mankiewicz, who was the president. He told me the same story, so I know it's true. And they said that Ford was sitting on the aisle wearing sneakers, untied sneakers, and a dirty jacket which had food stains and cigar ashes all over it, and didn't say a word. And the people were talking, and C.B. DeMille got up and made a long speech, an impassioned speech, and George Stevens made a speech against it, against what DeMille was saying, and there was a lot of back and forth, and Ford didn't say anything. They had a court stenographer there to write down what everybody said, and you were supposed to stand up, when you raised your hand it would be recognized. You had to stand up, say your name, and a slight description of yourself. Well, this went on for quite a long time, about 3 or 4 hours, and Ford didn't say a thing. And finally, after 4 or 5 hours of this thing, Ford finally raised his hand, and he was recognized. And he said, "My name's Jack Ford, I make Westerns." He said, "There's nobody in this room that knows better what the American public, what the public wants to see. And nobody knows better than C.B. DeMille." And he turned to DeMille and he said, "But I don't like you, C.B., and I don't like what you've been saying here today. And I move that we give Joe a vote of confidence and let's all go home." And that's what happened. So that's an ambiguous moment, but typical of Ford. He wasn't going to take the bullshit. He wasn't going to take any kind of dictatorial stuff, and DeMille irritated him. So he said it to him, "I don't like you, CB. I love that." That's so Ford, you know. Anyway, that's my story.
Could you talk about the relationship between John Ford and Jimmy Stewart or Henry Fonda?
Say that again? Where are you? I can't see you. Oh, there
Sorry,
you
right
are.
here.
Yeah.
Could you talk about the relationship between John Ford and Jimmy Stewart and Henry Fonda?
Well, Stewart and Ford had a very short relationship because they didn't work together until the 60s. They did Two Rode Together, and then they did a little thing in Cheyenne Autumn, and then The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And Jimmy told me when he first met Ford, he was interviewed for this picture. He said that he had certain things, that he had a horse that he liked to ride, Pie, and he told Ford this, and he said there was a hat he wore in a lot of Westerns he liked to wear. And Ford says, "Do you have hat approval in your contract?" Now, Jimmy told me that story. He said, "Do you have hat approval?" I said, "Yeah, but I didn't know what to say." The relationship was pretty good. There was one story, I can't remember now how it went. Jimmy said that Ford told, when he had action to happen, he would tell everybody certain things, but he didn't tell anybody what was actually going to happen. He told everybody individually what they were supposed to do, but he didn't like to give an overall speech. So Jimmy said, when Ford would say action, the whole place, he said, things happened, people were running around, and horses were loose, and Jesus Christ. He didn't know what was going to happen, and just kept going on, and all this hell, as he said, all hell broke loose. And that's the way Ford worked. It was a good way to work, actually. Don't tell them what's going to happen, just let it happen. See what they do. And Jimmy Stewart was one of the funniest people was the funniest person I ever met. Even his silences were funny. His silences were sometimes sardonic. I don't know how to explain it anyway better, but Jimmy was very funny. And he was funny about Ford, but he loved Ford. He was very impressed with Ford and scared of him like everybody else. Yeah, it was a good relationship. He liked Jimmy Stewart. How could you not like Jimmy Stewart?
I have two questions. Probably I only have time for one of them, so I'll go with this one.
I can't hear you, Don.
Okay, well, if I can hold this, I can probably do better. Peacock, and maybe more peacocks in the in the films of John Ford. What is the significance of Peacock as a name? It shows up more than once. That's one thing, and related to that is, like John Cassavetes after him, he tended to use a stable of really wonderful character actors again and again and again. Was he the first to do that?
Well, they called it the Ford Stock Company. And he did use the same actors quite often. Other directors did that, but not to the degree that Ford did. But Preston Sturges did that. He had the same actors he used from picture to picture, because he only made about 8 or 9 pictures. Yeah, a few people did that, but not as much as Ford did. He liked to have those people around him that he trusted and liked. I remember there were 2 stuntmen called Chuck. One was Chuck Robeson, and the other one was Chuck something else, I can't remember now. Chuck Hayward. And there was one was called Good Chuck, and the other was called Bad Chuck. And he had them on every picture. They were stuntmen. Oh boy, I miss these people. They were, I was a young pisher, and I knew all these older guys, and I wasn't totally uninterested in my contemporaries. I had no interest in talking to them at all, but I just liked to talk to the older guys because they knew a lot of stuff that the younger people didn't know. So I got friendly with Ford and Howard Hawks and Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant. Cary Grant was a great friend, very, very kind to me and very funny. Peter, he called me up. He said, in the 70s, in the mid-70s particularly, you couldn't open a newspaper or a magazine without reading some shit about me and Sybil Shepherd. We were having an affair. We were living together. And there would be some stuff that was very nasty about us all the time. So Cary Grant called me and said, Peter, will you for Christ's sake stop telling people you're happy and stop telling them you're in love? Why, Cary? Because they're not happy and they're not in love. I said, I thought all the world loves the lover. No, don't you believe it?
We have time for one more question.
Sure.
I recently rewatched your masterpiece, The Last Picture Show. Everybody in here should see that movie if they haven't seen it. And, okay, can I just take it? You have to hold it. All right. And I have a question. You've talked a lot about your influences, Wells, Hitchcock, especially maybe Howard Hawks. And, since The Last Picture Show is, I think you've even said it's a very classically shot film, even though it's very modern. And it's black and white. And it's only, 8 or 9 years after Liberty Valance. Can you talk about anything in that movie
about 8 or 9 years, yeah.
Can you talk about anything in that movie where you would say you were consciously influenced by John Ford?
I think I was influenced by Ford, period. But I'm not sure if there was anything specifically that I thought this is a Ford moment or something like that. I remember Hitchcock said to me, never use an establishing shot to establish. And I sort of knew what he meant. And on Picture Show, there's a good example of it, is that the funeral scene, remember the funeral scene when they bury Ben Jonson? The sequence begins with a bunch of close-ups, medium shots of close-up, basically of people praying or looking down or whatever, and the preacher is speaking. And I don't show the establishing shot until the end of the sequence, thanks to Hitch. But don't use an establishing shot. So I didn't have a wide shot of the funeral. I put that at the very end of the sequence, and it was much more effective. That's a good example from my work of what Hitchcock was trying to say to me. Hitchcock was great fun to be with, and very just the opposite of John Ford. You couldn't talk to Ford about anything, about movies or anything. Hitchcock loved to talk about his movies or a lot of movies, and particularly he liked to talk about how he did it or why he did it a certain way. So he was like a real kind of a master professor, actually. And I was lucky I had a lot of sessions with him. He used to invite me to lunch all the time. Always the same lunch, a New York steak, coffee, and that was it. So I ate the same thing. I said, what do you want? I said, I'll have whatever Hitch has. And it was always the same goddamn thing.
We have one more honorary question. Miss Stratton, who traveled with Mr. Bogdanovich, helped him get here. So she wanted to ask one last question. A good story, I'm sure.
I'm just wanting to... what is the whole Ford accident, happy accident that happened in Last Picture Show?
I'm trying to remember. Give me a hint.
It was where the sun came...
Oh, yeah. Well, that was interesting because Ford and Hawks used to say the best things in pictures happen by accident. And I didn't know what the hell that meant. And Orson Welles said the same thing. Best things in pictures happen by accident. Oh, I don't know what that means. So we were shooting Picture Show, and there was a scene by a tank dam where Ben Johnson, his big scene where he's talking to the boys about how he used to ride across this tank dam with it. He used to bet that he could get it. We had a girl that he was in love with that beat him at it and so on. And as we were shooting, we got to the location. It was kind of gray day, not particularly cold, but gray. And we started shooting the big scene with Ben, where he talks about his past and so on. And suddenly, the sun came out. I don't know, just if you said to me, would you like the sun to come out? And I'd say, yes. Where? Here. It's where it came out. And then it went behind the cloud and came out again. The scene was quite long. It went on for about 3, 4, 5 minutes. And it came out and went away. It came out and it was great effect. And as it came out the first time, I looked at the cameraman, Robert Surtees, director of photography, who was quite a distance away from me. He was way over there somewhere. And I looked at him and I went, meaning, can you photograph this with the sun coming out? And he went, which was a big help. But I remembered what Ford said it too, actually. The best things in pictures happen by accident. He said the same thing. But I remember what he had said and what Wells said, so I didn't cut. I let it play. And it was terrific. And the whole scene was amazing. The sun came out, all that. It was just very exciting. And there was one problem. Tim Bottoms forgot his one line that he had in the one scene. So in the sort of toward the end of the scene, he had one line, and he didn't say it. I looked at him, and he was sitting there. I said, and finally he didn't say the line. Finally, I said the line out loud, and then he said it. But there was about a 30 or 40 second pause, and you can't have 30 or 40 seconds in a scene like that with no sign. Eventually, so we shot it again, the scene, because of that screw up of the actor. And he says to me, I didn't forget the line, I was acting. I said, oh, sure. So we shot the scene again, and the sun did not come out. And we saw the scene, it was fine, no pause, but the sun didn't come out, and the other scene was so much better. So the other take was so much better that we used that, and I had to put in a cutaway to take out the 30 seconds. But luckily, we had a point of view shot of the field, and everybody was looking that way. Ben was looking in that direction, so we could just cut to the point of view for a few seconds to get rid of the pause. But there you are. That's the best things happen by accident. And if they hadn't told me that, I would have cut. I would have said, oh, he can't, won't, because the photographer said, well, I don't know if it'll work.
Thank you.
Yeah.